Welcome back to Satori Sounds and our new series. We're switching things up a bit here. Instead of just kind of talking about the well-being, we're actually going to try it and bring you along for the journey. Anything from mindfulness, journaling, cold showers, gratitude practices. We're going to try the trends, the classics, and some of the weird ones. In each of our episodes, we're going to pick a practice, test it in real life, and then come back with the honest bits of what helped, what didn't, and what we'd actually recommend adding to your toolkit. We'll also be creating objective skills for the practices so you can put them into action yourself. There's no expertise here, no preachy advice. It's just our honest curiosity, reflection, and leaving you with some takeaways if you want to practice it yourself. This week, we tried mindfulness and got distracted halfway through. Let's get into it.
Mindful's a funny term, I find, because from my experience of practicing mindfulness, you're almost doing the opposite. You're actually trying to not have it all filled with everything running around in your head, with everything going on. You know, it's the mind is still full in a way, but my experience of mindfulness, practicing it, was actually trying to just step out from a lot of those thoughts and just notice them a bit more. It's not trying to subdue everything. You're still letting it all kind of pass. And the way I kind of practiced it, and I started on the app Headspace actually for practicing mindfulness and going through that way, and there's lots of different tools out there, but it was described within that app of kind of stepping out as if you're looking on a bridge over a highway and your thoughts are the cars passing by, kind of on that motorway, and actually you're just sitting there letting them kind of pass through. And it's funny because when I started out, I thought it was trying to subdue everything and actually just stop it all, trying to not have those thoughts and force myself not to. And that was an interesting takeaway I found from practicing it, was you're not trying to subdue the thoughts. You're just letting them pass.
It's really interesting to hear that, because what you're describing there is a practice called thought diffusion, which is like an arm of mindfulness. And I always think the term mindfulness itself is kind of a catch-all term, I find. But the best description of the practice we're talking about I've ever heard to this date is from the most unlikely of sources. It's from a film called Layer Cake. Have you ever heard of it?
Yeah, I've heard Layer Cake, yeah.
You've heard of it? There is a single segment where the main character is talking to this other character called Gene, and I'm not going to go through verbatim what the characters say, but he describes meditation and mindfulness in such a detailed and thorough way, but simple and easy to follow. And he sets out quite nicely as it's the idea of finding a focal point and letting the front of your mind become engaged with that front focal point and being in the now. And so when you're doing thought diffusion, the focal point is your thoughts, noticing them and letting them pass. Other people might do it through their breathing. Some people do it through another action. So one of the things that I used to do mindfulness with was skipping, or even a speed bag, because you're just on the focal point, you're there. Everything else from your mind, sure, it might be ticking away in the background, but your focal point, your main focus, your attentional focus is somewhere else. And I think if you're a listener listening to this, Google Layer Cake, Google the meditation. Maybe you already know the scene, but watch that scene, and I think he sets it out so neatly and so simply that it will resonate.
That's a really good way of summarizing it. And that your point there actually of it being a multitude of different things, focusing different things like breathing. A lot of the exercises that I started with was just, noticing the senses and actually putting a singular focus on each of those and then moving to the thoughts. It's interesting that you'd practiced it through kind of speed boxing or different areas. Are there any other areas that you had kind of found that you could focus on or use?
Yeah, I think this is the thing with mindfulness. It's so bizarre because it can be anything. It's what guides your attention. It's what holds it in the present moment. So for the right now. So you're not zooming off to the future and you're not zooming off to the past. So it might be when I write, for instance, maybe poetry, maybe kind of short stories, whatever it is. It can even be when walking the dog. And that's the fascinating thing, is it can be across multiple activities. It doesn't just have to be sort of breathing. The traditional tool that you get, which is breathing or thought diffusion, it's a wide spectrum, and some people even do it with the dishes. And that's a fascinating thing, is that you can do it with something as mundane as the dishes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, though, actually, is that I think if we talk about meditation, most people's minds, I would imagine, will jump to someone sitting there quietly, likely with their eyes closed, in that kind of state of meditative state. But
Yeah.
actually, mindfulness doesn't have to be that, does it? It doesn't have to be that cliche.
And I think what's happened as well in our society, we've suddenly gone, oh, mindfulness is just about breathing, it's just about meditating. I'm going to need to shave my head and commit to Buddhism or something like that. And actually, no, you don't. Not at all. And I think there is been a massive miscommunication in our society, because lots of people won't touch it with a barge pole because it's got such a name or reputation around it already.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that puts a lot of people off. So the first part is that idea of, oh, I'm going to have to commit to almost this Zen lifestyle. Not at all. Don't have to do that at all. And the other thing I find that people sometimes do is they almost expect way, way too much from it. So they read the studies, they hear the stories, and they go, oh, well, it's a cure-all. Mm-hmm. It's not a cure-all either, but it is about giving you space in the moment. And I think that's something we've got to really drive home, is you're not going to practice one session of mindfulness for 5 minutes and suddenly all your problems are going to disappear. Or if it does, I'm amazed. Teach me.
Yeah,
if that happens. But it's never happened to me when I'm practicing mindfulness.
That's so true, though, because I've definitely had sessions where I felt I needed to. And the very thought of being like, well, I need to practice this because I need to clear my head, it therefore almost hasn't worked, because it is kind of that contrary of, well, I'm forcing myself to try and do this. And actually, it's, to me, I almost put it into a similar kind of label of how we've discussed habits, right? Is that it's actually the process of just continually turning up. It's not every time I've got to nail the perfect mindfulness activity. It's actually over time, you'll notice, a bit like going to the gym, like we described these other things, of that cumulative benefit of practicing it. And one of the things I found from practicing it as well, actually, is that my attention span went back up because of it as well. I found that I was able to concentrate on anything for longer. I actually found that being able to just hold a conversation, I was more engaged necessarily in a conversation, because instead of us being on our phones a lot and engaging in all these things being bombarded at us, I was able to kind of, without much brain power, shall we say, focus on the particular activity. So that's one of the benefits that it now makes sense reflecting on it, but I hadn't picked up on the moment when I was starting to practice mindfulness, is how much my attention span was able to be applied elsewhere. And I've definitely noticed when I haven't been practicing mindfulness consistently, the inverse correlation with my ability to concentrate.
I see. Okay, so you notice the cognitive benefits.
Massively.
That's the kind of thing that sticks out for you, is one, your attention. I think one of the things I noticed in sort of that cognitive aspect is how I then dissected thoughts and how I noticed thoughts. So for me, it was this idea of I'm having, and it comes back to the traditional thought diffusion, but I have done kind of mindfulness in other things. But in that vein, I've noticed, I go, well, I'm having that thought again. And it might be the thought of, I don't know, you could pick any thought you want, but I'm having that thought again. Where does that come from?
Mm-hmm.
How does that thought feel to have in my mind? Am I noticing other things that come in? Oh, that thought's gone. Isn't it interesting how that there's now the absence of that thought, and there's me now analyzing the absence of that thought, and it gets very meta. So I've noticed my ability to engage with my thinking has changed whenever I do mindfulness. And I think it helps generally to be less reactive in your mind, is the first thing I sort of noticed. Because sometimes you have a thought and you go, this is the thought, this is the fact, and it's not that.
That's a really good point. I think that's a really good point. That will resonate probably with a lot of people who, if they want to try this, as will see that, because you're right. It's come back to one of our favourite phrases of the curious scientist there, isn't it? It's that pausing of actually just seeing that thought coming through. I think there's a lot to be said for that. It's not the overanalyzing, but there is that pausing element to it, and being like, oh, actually, and repetitive thoughts. Actually, I found the other bit that kind of came into some of those practices that I was doing was checking in with myself of how was I actually feeling in the day. I kind of built that into that practice of mindfulness, because some days, you'd wake up and we've talked about this before, you're not feeling yourself, but actually I may not have realized that, but taking that second to pause, and I don't know when you found practicing it, but I often found practicing in the morning almost became a key cornerstone of part of my morning routine at that certain period. And I just found it was a really useful way for me to set up my day almost.
Yeah, it becomes part of your routine. And one of the things I think you noticed there was that idea of repetitive thoughts. So those intrusive thoughts that we all get, and they can be distressing and almost take you out of that flow. And I think the nature of thought diffusion, and there's a number of activities that you can do. It doesn't just have to be sort of the car on the bridge scenario. It can be things like imagining your thoughts as they're on a computer screen, maybe on MS Paint or in a Word document, and you're imagining changing the font, you're imagining making the thought smaller or bigger, representing it as certain things. And I think when you've got those repetitive thoughts, it can really help you, that particular practice can really help you get space from them. But one of the things we've been doing, because I think it's very clear, we're both very biased. We both love mindfulness and that kind of practice and that kind of meta skill. So what I'm going to try and do is offer some realities with mindfulness. And the first one I'm going to definitely say is it's not easy, particularly if you've not done it. Your brain gets so used to running at 100 miles an hour that when you ask it to slow down, it's like slamming on your brakes in your car or on your bike. You sort of come to a crashing halt with this screech and, okay, now I've got to get going again. And it's unlearning a lot of that unhelpful stuff. So it's going to be hard in that regard. So that's the first sort of challenge I would say that comes with mindfulness. Not that easy, even though it's free and you can do it anytime.
Completely agree. It's uncomfortable. We've portrayed it as this. We've posited it as this great tool, but I think you're really good to pick up on that. It's a really key point. It's uncomfortable. And I think also, how many people can comfortably say day to day, sit with their thoughts? I imagine me delivering that sentence just then, several people listening to this will wince, right? I can 100%. That sometimes.
Who's going to go home and sit with their thoughts? That's a horrible thing to do. Not me.
Exactly, right? But that's the reality. And so I think what we're breaking down here for the listeners is that we're talking about the benefits from us having practices over a period of time. And we're not saying we've done this just for the last 30 days. Over the last couple of years, we've talked about this at different periods. We've done this, I don't want to say every day, but on and off for a long period of time. And actually, it's easy to sit.
2 minutes on the mindfulness clock. A bit of a pro, not to brag.
But that... that uncomfortability, I think, will resonate with a lot of people. And I remember when I started, I could barely sit still for 30 seconds, let alone sit with my thoughts for 2 minutes flat. But I noticed that as the more I practice it, the inverse naturally became true as well, is that if I could easily go for 10 minutes and not even realize I'd done it. And so there is definitely that barrier to entry, but I agree. I think we can happily say we're both biased towards it and that we feel it works for us. And I think that's probably worth picking up on what is it actually therefore useful for. And I think from our perspective, what's it useful for? And I think we can both say that actually it's a good observation tool. It's also useful, I've found, if we've had some of those reoccurring thoughts of realizing there may be something underlying that you hadn't necessarily picked up on that you may want to address. So I think it can be useful in that sense. In terms of drawbacks, that'd be an interesting way to look at it inversely. Have you come across anything that you were like, I haven't really found it was that useful in certain areas, or something was a bit irritating?
Yeah, I think one of the things you have to remember for mindfulness is it's a way of creating space and helping you slow down. But there are times in life where you can't slow down and not do that. That's just not how the world works. So maybe it's a crisis situation, maybe it's an emergency situation, or maybe something is genuinely disturbing in your life. All the mindfulness in the world isn't going to change it. And that comes back to my statement earlier. It's not a cure-all. If you're genuinely in that moment where you're saying, this has really frightened me, this has horrified me, this has caused disgust or revulsion, these are really powerful emotions. Mm-hmm. And you might be able to settle yourself if you've got lots of experience doing mindfulness, or you're building up a good repertoire, or perhaps you've got other skills that you can use to distract yourself. But it's not going to take the feeling away. And also it can be harmful sometimes to slip into that, I just need to slow down, because there will be times you do need to react. So that would be a drawback. And I think that's more about context. Mm-hmm. But it comes back to that idea is it's not the panacea. that sometimes I think a lot of authors, a lot of apps, and a lot of, let's say, social media gurus can paint it out to be, because it's just not. You might get into an argument with someone who's really volatile, and actually you might go, I'm going to be really mindful. I'm going to be checking with myself and do my deep breathing. And the next thing you know, someone's kind of really shouting at you, or maybe being violent towards you. So you have to think, and that's the inverse of it. You have to think: is this an appropriate thing to engage with right now? That's obviously other people are going to draw their own conclusions and be like, "Well, I'm always mindful." Okay, good for you. Do you know what I mean?
That's me.
That's me.
That's so true. It's so true, right? And actually, I think that anything that we discuss, I think that we've ever discussed in this podcast, is part of a toolkit. We use some of these things as toolkits. Some things that we'll discuss in future episodes haven't worked for us, and they're not in our toolkit. That doesn't mean they're not going to work for someone else in their own toolkit. And that's really what we're trying to give people here, is their own toolkit that they can use. Something I found with it was that if I was having reoccurring thoughts, you could almost slip into an element of overthinking with some of it, because I was like, oh my God, that's something really like coming up for me. And it was an element of anxiety at work, of overthinking some issues that had been happening, and actually thinking maybe I'd overstepped a mark on something else. And actually I'd sat with it, and I'd mindfully in my head being the key word there, worked through it, prepared some conversation to have with the individual. And when I had the conversation with the individual, I played it up 10 times in my head.
So it sounds like you're naming the difference there. So I really like where you're going with this. I always represent mindfulness as a bit of a spectrum, that you've got mindfulness on one end and rumination on the other. And we all exist on that sliding scale. And what you're talking about there is when mindfulness, that noticing your thoughts, watching your thinking, or, well, I should say mindfulness, I say thought diffusion, when that starts to creep in to that overthinking element, and actually you're no longer being mindful, you're actually just spiraling.
100%. And I think that's a hard distinction as well, because we're not always going to be able to catch that with people in the moment. With people practicing this and trying it, you're not necessarily going to be able to catch that instantly. So that's something to be aware of. But I think definitely looping it back around to what we're just talking about with that thought diffusion, it is a very useful tool for slowing down. And that, I think, if people want to kind of slow down and make some observations, that thought diffusion element is definitely a key tool within that mindfulness box that I think will help a lot of people. It's just to check in with yourself. And that doesn't mean, if we break this down a bit more or how do you practice that, that doesn't necessarily mean sitting there for 10 minutes on a morning. You can maybe put that into your morning routine, but it might just be taking a moment out of your workday or whatever you're doing when you've got a quiet moment, just to do that at practice and check in with yourself.
Well, that's the thought diffusion element. And what we kind of named really, really clearly at the beginning was actually within this definition that Layer Cake provides, and the general sort of purist definition, it's about a focal point that keeps your mind in the present and focused on something. So if you want to play with your thoughts, that's an excellent thing to do, and there's space to do that. But it can also be things like, if you like stretching, there's nothing more grounding than stretching. You really go, oh my God, I feel the pull of my hamstring. That's a focal point.
That's something I avoid.
Cooking dinner, making sure things, any pain, any discomfort, count me out. No, but it can also be things like cooking, cleaning, sports. This is the thing. It's about finding the right focal point for you that you can access, that you can engage with. And there are some real benefits to doing that. And a bit of a risque example, I had a friend who in university was experimenting, rightly or wrongly, with psychoactives, basically. And he got a little bit too far with his psychoactive. And how he started to manage his way out of that was through the thought diffusion practice. So he started to go, well, I'm noticing there's a little pink elephant in the room that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I'm noticing that's making me anxious. And so it sounds like a really bizarre example, but these things have real world applications, even in really extreme and frightening examples like that.
Interesting. Yeah,
yeah.
But that brings that expands it a little bit for other people. But that, I wanted to loop round to that, and actually maybe we can unpick that to try and expand a little more for people. Is that sentence that you said about finding a singular focal point, because we've talked about breathing, we've talked about thought diffusion, we've talked about stretching, talked about you being able to do some writing, journaling, sports, whatever. So I think what we're saying to people is if they want to practice this isn't necessarily the only way you can do it, but ways that we found is finding something that's a singular focus of an activity and focusing on that. And I guess the immediate question that people will come up with was, well, for how long for? And actually timing, from my perspective,
how long's a piece of string?
Exactly. From my perspective, it isn't about it. It's the quality over quantity element again, right? Is actually focusing on it. And when you're making that observation, if you suddenly realize that your mind slipped, acknowledging that you've actually slipped and not beating yourself up necessarily, but actually going, oh, I'm not focusing on what I was meant to be doing. Let me bring myself back into the moment and actually doing that calmly and re-engaging with that activity. And I think I'd encourage people to practice that way, because I do remember myself when I was starting, it was almost like, oh, you idiot, you're not focusing, you've fucked up again. And actually,
so
you don't need to beat yourself up.
Yeah, so you're beginning to comment on the process of negative self-talk and how when you start to hear your internal narrative, how instead of, and that's what thought diffusion is about. So as soon as you start to agree with your internal narrative, you're then fused with your thinking. And so again, that's the traditional model that we're talking about, that when you notice that, comment on it. And that's the trick, is what's the focal point for you? If you're playing with your thoughts, you have to be on the ball with your thoughts. It gets very meta sometimes. That's why some people pick their breathing. It's why some people say do an activity, because they can't engage with that meta component. It's too cognitive. Not that people are stupid, but it's overwhelming. If you've got a busy mind, you're going, oh, I've got 101 thoughts, I don't know where to begin. Try something else. And this is the interesting thing about mindfulness. It's such an old practice that you can find something called koans, which are these old little puzzles, for instance, and almost like riddles in a way that don't have an answer per se, but you think about them and you engage with them like that. What does it mean? What could it mean? How does it mean that? What are they saying? And that is another focal point. So that's like 1,000 years old, and another example of how you can be mindful. And you don't have to do that particular one. You could literally do a Sudoku and you'd be being mindful. Something that keeps you right here and then, right in the now.
Sudoku. I haven't done Sudoku in years.
Oh, I actually love Sudoku as well. Do you know what I'm fond of? A crossword.
They've always been too mentally challenging for me.
Fair. I usually have to go straight to the answers at the back as well, but we will leave that bit out. I guess looking for answers is mindful. I don't want to cut it. They deserve to know the truth.
But it's funny that we're talking about there, because to me, a lot of this topic also drifts into the world of kind of play and flow a little bit, of actually finding activities. But it's amazing how all these elements, the more I've practiced and explored, a lot of these elements all just kind of overlap. And that's why I quite like the analogy for toolkit, because you can't just be like, well, I'm going to deploy this and this is going to work. You've got to kind of got all these other elements that all kind of, in a weird ecosystem, work together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the example that you've used, that term play. And this is the thing, mindfulness doesn't always have to have a point. And as soon as play gets a point, it becomes work. And you've got to be willing to play with your mind, play with your focus, play with your attention. It sounds so weird saying that. I can hear it. I'm like, ugh. But you do have to be in that space of, this is something I want to try, I want to experiment with, just because I like it or because I want to try it. As soon as you start forcing it, it becomes work, and that's when you're more likely to disengage with it. But with that said, let's give it a rating. What's your rating, Ollie?
Well, what I think we should do, because it's the first time, is explain what the ratings are. I'll give you my rating, and then and you give your rating, and then we should probably explain for it.
Let's explain what the ratings are.
We did this all.
This is perfect.
This is all offline, team, so we're going to break this down for you, because we've set this whole thing up offline, giving you zero context, and we're just going to rate it. So I'll give you my rating, and then I'll put some framework to it. And
welcome to the rating. Thunderdome.
So we'll be straight out with it. This idea has kind of come from the Top Gear call wall. right? It's something part of our
Oof.
childhood and it resonated, right? Is it something cool or is it not? And what we're going to do with each of these elements that we're going to break down over the coming series is we are going to split it down and we're going to call it the wellbeing wall. We're going to rate it A, B, and C, and Josh has got a little subtlety that he's going to add to possibly something else on the end for some. But we're going to basically break it down in A, B, and C, where A being the activity that we've been practicing over a certain period of time was worth it. B, we're going to break it down of, well, it was helpful, but it was overhyped. Ice baths. C, not one for us, or not adding it in, right? These are subjective for us. We'd love to hear the listeners' point of views. We're going to put these out on polls on social media as well. So everyone is happy to, I'm happy for them to shoot us down and tell us we're wrong. This is purely our experiences. We're trying them. We want to hear what you think of them. But I think it's fairly obvious from this discussion that I think mindfulness practices are worth it. How
Go
about
on,
you,
what's
Josh?
the letter? What letter are you giving it?
A. It's straight up A. It's worth it. But come on.
Straight up A. Dude, I'm going A as well. Purely just because I'm a big fan of mindfulness. Always doing mindful practices whenever I get the chance, really. The other rank that we haven't discussed yet is the S rank, and that's like gold tier, perfection. I don't think anything on our list is going to get an S, but you never know. We might find the magic wonder well-being cure. So with an A, I'd 100%, I'd recommend it. Jump in on the YouTube channel because we've got a mindfulness thought diffusion skill to get you started. So it's there for you whenever you're ready. But yeah, just give it a go. Find something for you. There's no set rule book. And watch the clip from Layer Cake. Big up Daniel Craig.
Well, yeah, we might have to just sub that in here, actually. In fact, it'd be a perfect reel. So we could take that and put it on a reel, right?
Yeah,
but
facts.
one of the takeaways then, I think, for the listeners, should you try mindfulness? I think we've clearly said we think it's worth it. I think if I'm summarising our conversation that we've had, if your mind's distracted, or you just want to notice and check in with yourself, or you want help slowing down, or from what I've talked about, actually being able to increase your attention span, it's worth it.
And the cognitive benefits, that's all there.
It's all there. There's lots, isn't there, right? But it also comes with that, I don't want to say caveat or warning, but we have touched on it. I think it's important to acknowledge that for people. It can be uncomfortable. That's okay. All we're saying is give it a go, right? And if you give it a go and you're really not comfortable, leave it, come back to it. But I genuinely do feel that people will have a benefit from trying this. If you're not comfortable just practicing yourself, there are loads of guides out there. Like I said, I actually started life using Headspace. I reckon if you even ask ChatGPT nowadays, you'd probably get something half decent out of it.
Or you should just listen to our clip. I'll die on this hill. Mindfully, that is. I will mindfully die on this hill.
Mindfully die on this hill.
Absolutely. Intentionally as well. We had to get that term in because what's a Satori Sounds episode without intentionality? What are you doing?
I wasn't obviously mindful in this episode to bring
Practice what you preach, dude. Honestly, this is ridiculous.
wasn't enough awareness in this episode.
Can't give us an A. Get them off the cool wall or the well-being wall. I will say, just to close this episode, mindfulness is the gateway drug to well-being. That's how I'd posit that.